Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Political Theory Institute. I'm Alan Levine, together with Tom Merrill. I run the Political Theory Institute. We have a few announcements before we get to today's event on Does Conservatism Have a Future? First of all, Patrick Deneen and I will be talking for the first half of the event, and we'll be taking questions for the second half of the event. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function on your computer. Type your questions succinctly, please, and identify yourself and your affiliation. It is our tradition to take questions first from students. So students, including alums, think about what you want to say and get those questions in. I also want to specifically welcome the students in SPA 29602, History in the Making. Glad to have you again. And we have 3 other events scheduled for this semester after tonight. I just want to mention those quickly. On October 15th, we have Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, in conversation with Tom Merrill on the topic, Do the Humanities Have a Future? The Liberal Arts Between Technocracy and Radicalism. On October 26th, we have Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution, and he will be talking about, does the center have a future in the United States? And after the election, we're hoping to have a post-election cleansing on November 19th, Fashion, Identity, and Freedom of Expression with Gwendolyn Gruel of the New School for Social Research in conversation with Ford and Flanagan. So today's event on Does Conservatism Have a Future is one of 3 such events on the deeper currents related to the election that we're running this semester. Last week we had one on Does Socialism Have a Future in the US? And I mentioned the one upcoming on October 26th, Does the Center Have a Future in the US? Each of these are conversations, not debates. I'm not going to be arguing with any of the speakers. But from the trio of them, we hope you'll draw your own conclusions and construct your own debate. I also want to mention to you a new podcast that we have going. My colleague Tom Merrill and Sarah Marsh of the American University Lit Department, Politics and the Humanities. That's available on iTunes and Spotify, all one word, Politics and the Humanities, about the connection of the two and the future of the humanities in our country. Our speaker today is Patrick Deneen. He is professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame and holds the David A. Potenziani Memorial College Chair in Constitutional Studies. He's also taught at Princeton and Georgetown universities. From 1995 to 97, he was a speechwriter and special advisor to the director of the United States Information Agency. He's the author and editor of several books and numerous articles and reviews, and has delivered invited lectures throughout the country and in several foreign nations. He was awarded the American Political Science Association's Leo Strauss Award for Best Dissertation in Political Theory in 1995, and an honorable mention for the American Political Science Association's Best First Book Award in 2000 for The Odyssey of Political Theory, The Politics of Departure and Return. He's also the author of Democratic Faith, about which he previously spoke at American University at the Political Theory Colloquium, the precursor to the Political Theory Institute. And I think you might have spoken a 3rd time now, I can't remember, at AU. He's also the author of Conserving America, Essays on Present Discontents, and Why Liberalism Failed. The latter book has caused a national sensation and been translated into dozens of languages. He's also an old friend, and he ran a similar institute at Georgetown University, similar to the Political Theory Institute, and we had several conversations about what that entailed when I was thinking of getting the Political Theory Institute going. So I thank him for that, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Patrick Deneen. And I'm going to just start, Patrick, with the title of our talk, Does Conservatism Have a Future in the U.S.? And I want you to sort of take a stab at that right off the bat, but then maybe put it in the context, or start to build up from the context of what's your view of the current state of conservatism, and how are conservatism and Trumpism related?
Sure. I'm
You're
not
on.
muted, right? Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me. The trip out was easy, and the easiest time ever getting through DC traffic. So it was really a pleasure. And when Alan said that we're old friends, emphasis is on the old. I think we've been on the planet for combined, I don't even want to count how many years, but it's good to see you again, and look forward to maybe visiting in person in the not too distant future. I guess the question is, in some ways, it assumes something that we might have to begin with first, which is not only does conservatism have a future, but does conservatism in America have a past? Might be the place to start, because I think it's debatable whether, in a certain sense, there's ever been a conservative tradition in America. And of course, these concepts, conservatism, liberalism, I mean, we could go down the list. They're difficult to define, and people all, will define them somewhat differently. But if we mean conservatism by a certain kind of, I think, broadly European understanding, something we would encounter with somebody like Edmund Burke, or a thinker who passed away recently, Roger Scruton, who I think in many ways is kind of the intellectual heir of Burke. We might have to say that as a kind of intellectual and even political matter, there's never really been a conservative tradition, philosophical, nor a genuinely conservative party like a Tory party before Margaret Thatcher. That has really ever existed in the United States. I would say that in some respects, America has had conservative currents as a way of life, as certain strands of thinking have picked up on some of this European conservative tradition, but it's never been sort of a full-blown tradition on its own. And that's a striking fact about America. America, as Louis Hartz argued in a book that he wrote in 1955, he wrote a book called The Liberal Tradition in America, in which he begins that book by arguing that there's only been one political tradition in America, and that tradition has been liberalism. And that, even if you think about the title of that book, The Liberal Tradition in America, there's a certain irony there, because part of what liberalism really is the overthrowing of tradition. In particular, the overturning of tradition as what is supposed to be a kind of governing force in political life. I mean, think about somebody like Edmund Burke. If the viewers are familiar with Burke, Burke argues that in some ways tradition should be authoritative in a society, almost more authoritative than the people who are currently living in that society. That the things we inherit, the ways of life we inherit, have a kind of presumptive force that ought to govern us, and that ought to, in a sense, rule. And you could say that America, certainly as a political matter, and maybe even as a pre-political matter, although this would be worth discussing, but certainly as a political matter, America begins in explicit effort to overthrow the claims of tradition. Right? I mean, the Declaration of Independence is a almost purely Lockean document, a liberal document, saying that the things that will govern us are the assumption that all men are by nature created equal, that we are not governed by any external authority that we haven't accepted on our own, that we haven't consented to, and that this consent is a kind of ongoing matter through elections, through our politics, so that tradition recedes to almost an invisible point, to a point of disappearance as a political matter in the American tradition. And there's a long tradition, if I could put it this way, a liberal tradition, in which people who come to the United States from particular cultures, from particular backgrounds, I'm of Irish descent, and within a generation or two, they more or less lose most of the thick traditions that would once have defined their sort of the horizon of their being and their identity. And this tradition I'm mentioning is a literary tradition in America that describes this kind of, in some ways, a kind of nostalgic and lamentable loss of these traditions, but also that it can be experienced as liberation. So the question then, does America have a conservative future? It would really depend what we mean by conservative. And if we mean by this the conservatism that I've just been describing, it's probably not likely that America has a conservative future, since it doesn't really have a conservative past in that sense. What we have defined as conservatism over the last roughly 50 years is really a form of right liberalism. You could even describe it as conservative liberalism, which is, really a species of liberalism. It's a species of liberalism that has emphasized especially what should be the dominant role of the free market in exercising our rights and freedoms as choosing individuals. That the primary place where we should exercise our liberal selves, the sovereign choosing self, who shapes and creates our own identities, as a consumer can do through their choices, is in the area of the marketplace. And it's been the project of right liberalism over the course of American history, arguably since Alexander Hamilton, that famous Broadway actor, that this was the right liberal project. I think it's genuinely a question whether even that conservative tradition has legs going forward in the future, since it seems to me that part of what happened in 2016 was the Republican voters rejected that part of the Republican Party's right liberal tradition. So I think, the question is fraught because it assumes a certain definition. But it may be not only that conservatism in this more European sense does not lie in America's future, but maybe even right liberalism may not lie in America's future.
So for what has been called conservatism and neoconservatism in the US over the last 40 or 50 years, the political strategists usually think of as a three-legged stool, right? The laissez-faire economics that you mentioned, coupled with a muscular foreign policy where the US would be the leader of rights around the world, and a social conservatism at home. So of those, that triad that had been the coalition of political conservatism in this country over the last 40 or 50 years, what do you think is the state of that right now?
So it seems to me that, we, in the midst of the very hectic last 3.75 years during the Trump presidency, there's been a lot of analysis about what happened and how this happened, but a lot of that has been just so fraught with, people's deep sense of crisis and foreboding about what lie ahead of us. And in some ways, I think the answer is in some ways much more mundane if we can just begin to disassociate the personality and Twitter persona of Trump from what really happened in the election of 2016. And I know everyone has maybe their own pet explanation of this, but I think it really was the reconfiguration of the Republican Party that was already happening after 1989, after the end of the Cold War. It had been happening kind of below the surface for a number of years, but it really broke out in sort of full view in the campaign leading up to the vote of 2016. And what had been happening under the surface was what was just described as the three-legged stool had been a stool that was held together. How you can picture a stool held together by the seat, right? The three legs going up into the seat. The seat that held it together was the Soviet Union, was the presence of the Soviet Union and the threat of Soviet communism. So the three legs actually didn't necessarily have a lot in common. And the only sort of glue holding them together was this external threat. So you had economic libertarianism, represented by someone like Milton Friedman or Arthur Greenspan, the former Fed chair, who'd been an acolyte of Ayn Rand. So this is someone who believes. If you've ever read any Ayn Rand is not exactly the world's greatest representative of family values, for example. If you've read any Ayn Rand, everybody's sleeping with everybody, and everyone is an iconoclast, overthrowing anything that's sort of traditional. The night watchman state is, at least as many of these thinkers thought of it, should be largely defensive in nature. You have an army that doesn't seek to explode the federal budget. You don't want an adventurous foreign army. So you could say the economic libertarian leg wasn't altogether that comfortable with the sort of evangelical, conservative, Christian, social conservative leg, nor necessarily with what became a kind of project of liberal internationalism, of sort of spreading democracy abroad, that especially became prominent during George W. Bush's administration. And I think you could go down the list of all three of these legs and talk about the ways that they were internally in tension with each other. But because of this external threat, this force outside of the United States, were held together for a lengthy period of time, about a period of about 50 some odd years, from about the end of the Cold War, past 1989, and in some ways somewhat reinvigorated after the attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001, but even then starting to get wobbly. The stool was getting wobbly. So what we saw in the election of 2016 was the electorate rejecting the construction of that stool, and in particular, rejecting two of those legs. Candidate Trump, for all of his inarticulateness, and we can all acknowledge his many shortcomings as a person, certainly as a political leader, but he did have a kind of idiot savant genius that might be in some ways related to his business background of identifying a market that wasn't being served. And what he identified was that the Republican electorate was no longer on the page with the sort of Republican elites who continued to think that the stool that had been constructed during the Cold War was still a viable piece of furniture. And so what you notice is that Donald Trump ran especially against two of the legs. And again, haltingly, never really all that articulately, not in a sustained way. But on the one hand, I think most obviously he ran against economic libertarianism, the thing that many people had associated with what conservatism was for the last 50 years. People would say, well, someone like Paul Ryan is a conservative because he likes Ayn Rand. But the sort of the working class voter that I think increasingly have been drawn to the Republican Party, even during the Reagan years, was being really damaged economically by a globalized economic order, by free trade agreements, and by effective open borders that allowed especially low wage workers to come in and compete for a lot of jobs. And, in many ways threaten the sort of social standing of the working class, social and economic standing in particular. The idea of building the wall was literally to stop the global marketplace from continuing to expand and transform the American economy and American society. So Trump really was, it was a heretical position to take within the Republican Party. And what continued to surprise the candidates during the primary was that Trump was getting this enormous support for this position throughout the primary season. So it wasn't only just that he was this outsized personality who was, giving everybody nicknames. He had his finger on the pulse of where, especially the dominant force in the Republican Party electorate was on economic questions. And he also, again, this was perhaps less of a major note and more of a minor note. But if you remember, it was in the South Carolina debate where there were like 15 people on stage. All of them were talking about the importance of the military, were expressing their patriotism, and Trump gets up and he says how bad he thought the Iraq War was, what a failure it was, what a terrible decision it was, how George W. Bush had made a terrible decision. He points to Jeb, he says, your brother made a terrible decision in the Iraq War. And everyone on the stage is shocked. And a lot of the people who were sitting in the audience, the Republican sort of elite, were shocked that anyone would say this. No Republican political figure had ever dared to say that the Iraq War was a bad idea. But the electorate had broadly come to the conclusion that both the Republican as well as the Democratic leadership that had supported the war had made a terrible mistake. Many of them not only thought the Iraq War was a mistake, but in general wanted to get out of America's post-World War II extensive commitments all across the world, in a sense saying we need to draw down the empire. This was again a position that was just not on the radar of sort of the DC class of the Republican Party, but it was where the rank and file electorate was on these questions. Now, Trump also understood that social conservatives would continue to support the Republican Party that was less libertarian economically and less adventurous militarily. And so he sought to keep and even strengthen that stool by promising to appoint a number of judges on a topic that's, of course, been in the news. And what we notice is that he received a lot of support from the kind of traditional social conservative voters, evangelicals, more conservative Catholics, Orthodox Jews, and so forth, that Trump received support. Now, it was interesting, and he continues to get a lot of note for this. He was not the kind of figure that traditionally Christians would support. He was, let's say morally, not exactly a paragon of what a Christian would think should define the behavior and demeanor of a Christian statesman. But I think something had changed in the broadly Christian, especially evangelical world in the 20, 30 years. We went from a time when, if those of you of a certain age can think back to this, we went from a time when when Christians in particular talked of the existence of a moral majority. Going back to the elections in the 1980s, so figures like Pat Robertson, who ran for president, an evangelical minister who ran for president, arguing that we needed to allow the voices of the moral majority to reassert the social values in terms of public policy in the form of church prayer in schools, forbidding abortion, reinforcing marriage between a man and a woman. I mean, you go down the list, the agenda of social conservatives from the 1980s, it was all about what was seen as where the moral force lie with the majority of the voters and the moral imperative lie. By 2016, things had obviously changed a lot. And so abortion remained a kind of consistent issue and concern of evangelical voters. And with the idea and ambition of overturning Roe versus Wade, but this was basically the idea that we would return to the condition that we had before Roe, which would be to let the states decide on the question of abortion. And so effectively, even overturning Roe would in all likelihood mean that there would not be any actual reduction in the number of legal abortions in the United States. People would just go to the nearest state where you could get a legal abortion. So it would just in some ways be a symbolic marker for many Christians. But in terms of its actual effect, I think we're all caught up in, thinking what would it be, The Handmaid's Tale or something. But in actual effect, we know what states would retain legal abortion. We know what states would limit abortion, and there'd be a number of states who would be somewhere in between. But in a host of other issues, there was no more argument for a moral majority. And even on the abortion issue, there really wasn't an argument for a moral majority. What it really was a kind of defensive stance. Don't force us to do the things that we don't accord with our religion. Right? Don't force us to hire people who want to marry a gay partner. Don't force us to do such and such. And this is where the crux of the debates have been, certainly since the Obergefell division.
And so you think that the moral, what used to be felt as a moral majority, now understands itself to be a moral minority under siege?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so now the issue is we want someone who's going to fight for our religious liberty. So it's much less important for these figures in the Christian evangelical world to have someone who's going to represent them as a leader of the moral majority, and rather have someone who's going to fight to defend their now minority status in the broader culture. And they saw Trump as someone, you hear again and again from people who supported him, at least he fights. He doesn't back down. He stands up, and he would appoint the kinds of judges that would support these kinds of religious liberties. So all this is to say that the chair, this three-legged stool, was completely reorganized, and I think this was really the main takeaway from the 2016 election is that, at least one main takeaway, is that it wasn't just that Trump beat Hillary. Trump first beat the Republican Party. He beat the Republican Party that had existed for 50 years. And we're still seeing, in some ways, and we're still assessing whether that reconfiguration of the stool is likely to be, sort of permanent, at least as far as the Republican Party goes, for the foreseeable future.
And do you have a thought on that? Is Trumpism a stable basis? First of all, what is Trumpism? Is there more to it beyond like sort of the three-legged stool that we just talked about? And is it a stable basis for conservatism in the future, or is it more of a wrecking ball of the past, and who knows what's going to happen after?
Yeah. Well, we'll know in about 3 weeks what, in some ways, what the future holds. I actually think, in some respects, that the new three-legged stool that I just described is actually is a more stable arrangement, philosophically, as a philosophical matter. It's the three parts of it, in some ways, make more sense together. Kind of, in some ways, you could say, I know it sounds crazy to suggest this, but what Trump in some ways was appealing to was the base of the old Democratic Party. We constantly call him a conservative, but what he was really appealing to was a working class, obviously, much more white working class, that wanted to have its position defended through government programs. So one of the interesting things about Trump is he didn't propose cutting social programs. I mean, I know he talked about cutting the health care, eliminating the Obamacare. But for example, he ran on say, I won't cut Social Security. In 2016, he said this over and over during the campaign. He appealed to the broad, we could say, middle-class entitlement programs that people have really come to rely on. And again, in contradiction to an older Republican tradition, he didn't talk about slashing government spending. If anything, government spending has gone up significantly, and he's been eager to sign all kinds of bills, especially since COVID, to increase government largesse and to increase deficits as a result. But there's a way in which these three legs were the three legs of the Democratic Party in some ways. It was economically more nationalist and protectionist, going back to the 1950s, 1940s, and 50s Democratic Party. It was, I don't know if I would call it isolationist, but before World War II, it was hesitant to commit American troops abroad. Leading up to both World War I and World War II, the sort of Midwest sentiment was not to get involved in Europe. Right? This is a very old American tradition, going way back to George Washington and his farewell address. Don't get involved, especially in the kind of, the complicated political affairs of Europe, which will corrupt America. And so the post-World War II international engagement and what some have described as liberal internationalism, a kind of robust effort to spread liberal democracy abroad, both through military as well as economic and social power, was more of an aberration in American history than it was really its norm. And so following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, I think there was a growing sentiment in that part of the electorate that they wanted to kind of return to that. And there was a lot of, resistance on the part of the sort of DC establishment to drawing down American troops and sort of the American footprint. Because obviously it's exciting to be part of, and it gives one a bit of a high to be part of a world order in DC as part of the international establishment. And why would one want to abandon that? And lastly, and again, we tend to forget this, but the FDR kind of Democratic Party coalition was pretty socially conservative. It was dominantly, well, I don't want to say it was dominant, it was a lot of Catholics, a lot of evangelicals. It was a lot of inner city Catholics. The people who tended to be more socially liberal were Republicans during those days. That was the party of the kind of liberal elite. So in some ways, I know it sounds strange to hear this because, again, we're so much caught up in this current moment of thinking of Trump as this proto-fascist. But in some ways, it's a much more mundane explanation, which is that Trump was obviously in a different place in a different time, appealing to an older Democratic Party that, oddly enough, is the Democratic Party from which Joe Biden himself emerged, and positions that Joe Biden himself once assumed and had to repudiate during the course of the primaries.
So, are you suggesting that the whole political debate in our country has shifted leftward recently? That what had typically been the triad of the Republican Party has been abandoned for the more traditional Democratic position, and the Democrats have abandoned their more traditional position in favor of a more progressivist socialist position?
Yeah, I don't know if it's moved. I think what is clear is that the Democratic Party, or some portion of the Democratic Party, has moved significantly leftward. I think in some respects, to the extent I began by saying there's no really conservative tradition in America, but to the extent that you can identify something of a conservative tradition, this is sort of it. What Trump was appealing to was kind of this less developed philosophically, but a kind of dispositionally conservative position. And I mean in the following sense: it's aligned with, as I say, it's aligned with kind of the working class. And we don't typically think of that as conservative because we've often thought of the working class as being liberal or supporting liberal causes, and especially the expansion of government programs, which has been the opposite of what conservatism is. But the working class, Marx knew this. Marx knew that the revolutionary class was not the working class. You had to make them into a revolutionary class. What you needed were elites who would turn the working class into a revolutionary class and might even have to work against the working class in the name of the working class. Because the working class tends to be pretty conservative, right? They actually kind of want sort of mundane things like stability and home and 3 square meals a day, and they don't want the world to be turned upside down. Because guess what? Those people tend to really suffer when the world gets turned upside down. So I think in some respects, the alignment of a kind of economic protectionism, a foreign policy modesty, let's say, which I think that's one of the things that no one has really talked about the entire campaign, is the fact that Trump has really been, I think, fairly admirable in his foreign policy. He's actually hasn't gotten us into any crazy wars. He's rattled the saber a bit, but we actually haven't committed troops in any new way anywhere in the country. And he's actually drawn down some battles and fostered some remarkable partnerships in the Middle East in recent months. So I think the desire for America to become having less of a sort of aggressive footprint in the international stage, while standing up against the new hegemon, the new competitor, China, and then acting as a kind of defender of especially a sort of social conservative Christian part of the country that sees itself increasingly in this more defensive position that isn't, I think, has largely abandoned certainly for the time being, has abandoned the idea that America can or should be governed by the moral majority, and is really kind of seeking to carve out these spaces of religious liberty. I think in some ways that's a kind of a stable, potentially stable arrangement of conservatism. But let me just 2 sentences more. What I think is likely to prevent that from becoming and sort of cohering as a potentially very stable new stool is Trump himself. The way that Trump has governed, or let's say maybe not governed. So all the things that were virtues for candidate Trump, his iconoclasm, his willing to sort of break things, his willing to appeal directly to a highly discontented part of the population, actually served very poorly once he was an executive, once he had to run the government. This kind of shoot from the hip, fly by night, I'll just provoke these people, I'll shoot off some tweets. What is very clear over the last 4 years is he had a few phrases, he was able to appeal to this untapped market, but he didn't have a developed policy agenda. He didn't have a set of pieces of legislation that he thought would be the sort of the features, the hallmarks of his administration. If we think about it, what's the one thing he really got done, and arguably not even he really got done during his 4 years, was to pass a tax cut, which is, that's what the Republican Party's been doing forever. It's not the thing that I think his electorate actually thought they were voting on behalf of. So in many ways, I think Trump discovered this market, this political market, but his behavior and his lack of actual ability to govern may very likely have the effect of preventing that from becoming a long-standing sort of political formulation and coalition moving forward.
Yeah, interesting. So I have 2 more political questions that I'm going to combine, and then we'll get more philosophical. And the political questions, following from where you just left off, if Trump's governing is part of the problem, do you see any promising conservatives today on the horizon, either politicians or intellectuals? And in 1919, there was a big conference, the National Conservatism Conference, that you participated in. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and did anything come out of that? But basically, promising individuals on the horizon.
Yeah. Well, I think that we already are seeing positioning taking place in the Republican Party of people who are viewing themselves as potential successors to Trump's discovery of this realignment within the Republican Party. And so I think if Trump loses, or even if Trump wins, but let's just say, as the polls seem to suggest, that Trump loses, those people will be positioning themselves, but there will be a real fraught battle that will take place between the old right liberals of the sort of previous generation of Republicans. And it's interesting whether they will sort of seek to reclaim the Republican Party. Now, many of them actually have now drifted, at least in nominal support of Joe Biden, the Democratic Party. And it may be someone like Bill Kristol. It may be that Bill Kristol will try to sort of make his home in the Democratic Party and exert influence there, seeing that, concluding that the Republican Party is no longer a viable home for his vision of a kind of robust liberal internationalism. But I do think there will be a number of people who will attempt to reassert the kind of older right liberalism that once defined the Republican Party. But I do think that there's going to be, whether it's after another 4 years of Trump, or whether it's after 4 years of a Biden-Harris administration, there's clearly people who are positioning themselves, shaping themselves in this, to appeal to that new stool. And I think three of them spoke at that conference you mentioned, the National Conservatism Conference, and one didn't, but well could have. The two that spoke that seemed to me quite plausible was Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, who I think is probably in terms of policy and sort of strategic thinking, seems to be the shrewdest of the people sort of positioning themselves after Trump. He's picked a number of issues that are designed to appeal precisely to the electorate that elected Trump. So very strenuous opposition to China, critiques of China, various opposition to the monopoly. Really interesting that this is a popular position. This is right. This is sort of the woke capitalism that's upsetting to this part of the party. And kind of an attack on political correctness ongoing. The other person who spoke that I think would have more of the populist appeal, because Hawley's fairly polished. He actually did his degree at Stanford with a colleague of mine who teaches at Notre Dame now. The more populist figure would be Tucker Carlson, who also spoke at the National Conservatism Conference. And Tucker is he's got the most popular television show on cable television, in spite of the fact they keep trying to shut him down. He has a huge viewership, and he's immensely popular with the Trump crowd. And if you followed what Tucker's been doing, he's been following exactly the script of Trump. He's a critic of sort of capitalism as a morally dubious economic system. He is a kind of constant critic of woke capitalism and of sort of PC positions. He's a critic of China. So he's hitting all of those, and he has the kind of more popular kind of appeal that of someone like Donald Trump had. The other figure who didn't speak at the conference was Senator Rubio of Florida, who was kind of retooled himself as a kind of Trump-esque person. He had, when he ran in 2016, he was trying to be the heir of Ronald Reagan, and he's retooled himself now as the kind of heir of Trump. He gave a highly discussed speech, highly noted speech at the Catholic University in America, in which he called for something called common good capitalism. So again, talking about the ways that capitalism needs to, or let's say the Republican Party's way that it thinks about capitalism has to move away from its kind of Milton Friedman-esque sort of, just purely cowboy open border free markets to a consideration of how markets operate either to support the values of sort of ordinary working class people, or they undermine those people. The last person who spoke, who doesn't hold political office, but might well hold political office, and he might be, sort of a contender in another 8 years, perhaps. But that would be J.D. Vance, who spoke at that conference. And I know J.D. is someone who's, this is the author of the book Hillbilly Elegy. He's someone I know who has been considering a run for political office, possibly for a Senate seat in Ohio. He's been talked about. And he's someone else who, all these things I just described, has broken what he calls conservatism.inc, the sort of mainstream DC conservatism, Republican Party conservatism, and really has embraced the more populist kind of conservatism that Trump exposed. So I think if there are going to be legs in this particular configuration of the stool, I would think one of those four would be the most likely to carry that forward.
Okay, I'd like to get a little more philosophical, and maybe we have 10 or 15 minutes to do this and talk a little bit more about your own views and where you might like things, your vision of conservatism in the future. But first, to get into that with something that you mentioned earlier, that what's gone by the name of conservatism in our country is really a kind of a right liberalism, or in your view, a kind of right liberalism as opposed to a left liberalism, but both liberalism. And so can you say a little bit more, because you have this discussed book, Why Liberalism Failed, what the problem is with liberalism in both the liberal and conservative sense. And then maybe once we understand that, we'll go towards some solutions that you see or might like to see.
So, yeah, thanks. It's obviously a big question, and I'm actually working on a book right now that's trying to articulate this. So I give you maybe a little preview, but I try not to talk at too much length about it. So essentially, what you describe, I think, right, as America, I've suggested America has always been a liberal country, and it's been, especially in the post-World War II period, has been defined by a division between right liberals, what we call conservatives, represented in the Republican Party, especially in the figure of someone like Ronald Reagan and his successors, and then a left liberalism, which, in some ways, someone like Bill Clinton or President Obama would represent a kind of left liberalism. And the debate, in some ways, isn't about whether we should be a liberal country. There's an agreement, and that's why, in some ways, while the differences between the two parties, of course, could be intense, especially around election time. They never felt quite like this election feels. Like, we could have violence break out at any moment. It felt like, it felt more like a game with a well-scripted set of rules. And, you played by those rules, and then whoever won, and the other party said, okay, we'll come back and play by the same rules, and maybe we'll win next time. And that was kind of how politics proceeded over the last 50 to 70 years, because there was basically an agreement that America is a liberal country. And by liberal, I mean a society formed with the ambition of allowing people essentially to live their lives as they wish without the imposition of any single view of how people should live. This is kind of the classic idea of sort of American live and let live, laissez-faire, why the pilgrims came to America, to be able to worship as they wish, to be free from the impositions of the king, and so forth. But within the philosophical world of liberalism, there's a kind of, let's say, there's always a kind of underlying extreme point of this view. And the extreme point of that view is essentially in order to be genuinely free, the individual human being has to be genuinely free of any external obstacles to the achievement of that person's desires to the greatest extent possible. Obviously, we have something like John Stuart Mill's harm principle, saying that you can't pursue what you desire at the price of harming another person. But short of that, you should be able to do whatever you wish. And a main ambition, we could say, within liberalism, as it has unfolded over the years, is for this particular strain within liberal philosophy to become more and more realized as an object of our political life. Now, in right liberalism, the argument was that the proper sphere for this to take place was in the economic realm. And this is why, for 50 years approximately, what we heard were arguments that you want to have as few obstacles to the free exercise of consumer choice. Right? The sovereign consumer should have as great a freedom to exercise their choice within the market as is imaginable. And because markets, have been historically constrained geographically within nations, the argument became we can't constrain our choices merely within nations. We have to move markets onto this global stage, right? To think about a global workforce and a global resource base, and to make the sovereign individual within this global market, right, supreme, right? So to liberate us completely within this marketplace and to expand the marketplace without limit to the point in which no corner of the globe was untouched by this logic of the market. And this was the project of right liberalism, which combined with a kind of conservatism, which was to say, at the same time, we value the family, we value the community, we value religion. This was Ronald Reagan's famous arguments for family values, because part of the stool were those social conservatives. Now, left liberalism have made the argument that for us to really achieve this kind of equal liberty, you actually needed the assistance of the state. You couldn't achieve a condition of equal liberty if we all started, if we all were supposed to run this race, but people were starting at different starting points, and not everyone was at the starting line. So that the state needed, in many ways, to step in to make it more possible for everyone to run the race of life from an equal position. So it retained this liberal ideal of equal liberty, but it argued that the state had a role, especially in restraining the inequalities that occurred in the marketplace. But over this same period of time that the Republican Party was becoming more and more libertarian in economic policy, the Democratic Party was becoming more and more libertarian in the social realm, in that area that we call sort of family values, the culture wars. So that the libertarian aspect, this expression of individual self, the ability of a person to shape and create the person that I am, the genuine person that I am, is ideally achieved in the social realm. And the state becomes a sort of helpmeet in allowing me both to protect me in making those kinds of free choices, and even allowing me, giving me material assistance in that pursuit. Over this period of time, I think what's striking is that right libertarianism of the marketplace and left libertarianism of social liberty both won consistently. It wasn't that we became a society more defined by sort of conservative family values, as well as a more restrained and moral economic order. Rather, what we saw over the last 50 years was the kind of triumph of liberalism, affected through kind of this oscillation between left liberalism and right liberalism, in which the more liberal side of those two parties consistently won, in which they consistently triumphed. So it's my view that a conservatism, properly said, would in some ways be the opposite of that. And if you allow me, I think I can do this.
Go ahead.
I want to try to share, if I have it. I want to try to share. No, it's not. Here it is. Okay. Is that coming up for you there?
Yes.
Okay. I want to share a breakdown of the electorate in the 2016 election. This chart might be known to many of you, but if it's not, it's really valuable. What this chart maps, do you see my cursor on this?
Yeah.
Okay. What this chart maps is basically liberal to conservative views on two axes. This axis on the bottom is the economic dimension. So -1 is what by this chart and this survey is what's called more liberal. Now, what's confusing is that by more liberal, it means
we have
more
a request to make the chart bigger.
Yes.
Is that possible?
Okay. Not sure. Oh, there. Okay. Is that getting bigger for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. This axis here, over right here, -1. We call that liberal. It's what we call liberal in economics. That means the most interventionist, right? That means the most likely to have government intervention in the economy. Whereas this is over here is the most conservative, which again, definitions here, but that would be the most libertarian economics. So the fewest obstacles in the economic realm. And this axis measures social issues in which the -1 is the most liberal, now in the libertarian sense, meaning the least amount of restrictions on social choices, abortion rights, gay marriage, transgender issues, and so forth. So, as you would expect, the most liberal, we would describe as the most liberal Democrat, would be down here. Whereas up here is the most conservative on these issues. So each of these dots represents 10,000 voters in 2016, with the red dots being Trump voters, the blue dots representing 10,000 voters for Hillary Clinton. And as you can see, what this shows is that the huge number of the Democratic Party voters are down here. Look at this concentration, how blue this is down here. These are the people who are most economically liberal and socially liberal, which is to say most interested in a kind of more managed economy or a more social welfare type economy, and absolute libertarian freedom in the social domain. And this is the party up here of Ronald Reagan. This is the libertarian economics, right? So the most libertarian, what we call conservative on economic issues, and the most conservative up here, the most conservative on social issues, restrictions on abortion, religious liberty issues, and so forth. Now notice the difference here. You don't have the same concentration of people up here as you have down here. If these two parties were genuinely the opposites, you would have this massive concentration of Republican voters up here. But notice who voted for Trump. They really span this whole part of the graph. And it turns out that there is a very sizable, and indeed arguably almost as sizable a portion of the electorate as any other portion of people who are on this side of the axis and this side of the axis. We don't have a word for them. They are socially conservative and economically liberal. They are the people who tipped the balance of the election to Donald Trump. These are many of the people who tipped the balance of the election in the last probably 10 elections to the candidate who won. This is the part of the electorate that no politician has essentially run to from either major party over the last 50 years. And Donald Trump ran to this part of the party. Now, something else worth noting about this down here, this is a purely libertarian party. This is Ayn Rand is down here, right? And notice something, it's almost completely empty. You see a bunch of little yellow dots, and those are probably votes for the Libertarian Party candidate. So those are non-Democrat, non-Republican votes, and a few scattered plottings of red and blue dots. But this is one of the really interesting takeaways from 2016. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you spend a lot of time in Washington, you can't cross a street without running into some libertarian institute, the Cato Institute, AEI, Heritage Foundation. You know, you would think, based on the thickness and the number of these institutions in Washington, D.C., that everyone in America, or at least a huge number of people in America, are libertarians or potentially libertarians. But you look at this graph, and that part of the electorate essentially doesn't exist. As I like to say, libertarians are not found in nature. Really, what Trump discovered, or he intuited, is that there's a large part of the electorate up here. So it's my view that if you had not just a candidate who could recognize that there is this part of the electorate, and indeed ran to this part of the electorate, socially conservative, that is to say, arguing for the kinds of quote unquote family values, and not necessarily doing it in such a way that intends to be divisive, but stresses how life success for human beings depends essentially on your ability to form and to sustain a family of a mother and a father who can raise their children. This is simply every social science finding that has ever existed on this question shows that children who grow up in a family that's able to maintain itself with two parents, those children succeed in just about every measurable area of life. And children who don't grow up in those kinds of homes tend to really suffer, tend to really do quite badly. I think you could make the argument, and I think you would have a coalition that could govern and win for a long period of time. This is what I would say would be a kind of post-liberal vision of American politics, which isn't, it's not without precedent in American politics. I already said that in many ways, this is where the Democratic Party used to be. But it would be effectively to restrain, let's say, to push back against the two dominant strains within the liberal tradition, which is the liberation of the human self as the sovereign chooser in the marketplace, and the liberation of the human self as the sovereign chooser in the sexual marketplace. And rather to argue that human beings need moral structures in both of these areas of life in order to thrive, in order to flourish. And you base a kind of political program with policies on winning this part of the electorate. Not only does it seem to me that it would be a viable political strategy, but in my mind, it would be a genuinely, potentially sort of post-liberal political agenda and position.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions. Thank you for that. I want to a lot of questions from the audience, but I'm just going to ask two before I turn it over. And the first one you've more or less just asked, but I want to just ask you maybe for a concise formulation, if you can. What should be conserved by a conservative? What should be conserved? And does it matter if it's in the United States as opposed to anywhere else?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer in America because America is not really terribly good at conserving things.
In your view, what should be
Yeah.
conserved?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because so much has already been destroyed, in my view. I would stress two things in particular. I think to the extent that they still exist, local culture should be conserved. And that's difficult to do because local culture needs a kind of local population. And America prides itself on its mobility from the very beginning. And so it's difficult to develop and sustain local cultures over any length of time because the population is likely to change so quickly. But America still is a land that, at least historically, has had a rich variety of local cultural forms. I mean, we can just begin to think about all the different food types from all the different parts of the country. Southern, Louisiana, New Orleans food, and the New England accent, and the different kinds of music from the South and from the Northeast and from the Midwest. It seems to me that having local forms of culture is the essence of what a kind of conservatism is. And to the extent that these forms of local culture have been increasingly destroyed, we've replaced it with a kind of thin and, it seems to me, decultured nationalism, and a kind of rah-rah abstract patriotism that you used to see at least on display in football games with military flyovers and so forth. And I mean, no disrespect to the military by any stretch, but it seems to me that when you eliminate and you destroy by either attrition or actual effort these kinds of local cultures, what's very likely to take its place is a kind of form of nationalism that we've mistaken as conservatism. I think has been called conservatism, but seems to me in many ways to be its opposite. And the other thing I would say that would be conserved, and this runs against, I think, what many people might expect, is the natural world. I think Roger Scruton, whose name I mentioned earlier, I think was one of the greatest articulators and defenders of a conservatism that seeks to defend and to conserve the natural world. That's what the meaning, the basis of the word conservationist is, to conserve the natural world. And it is really, it seems to me, one of the tragedies and flukes of the Cold War that one of the dominant positions of conservatism, which was libertarian economics, came especially to dominate the view of what conservatism was in relationship to the natural world. So a conservatism worthy of the name is a conservatism that seeks to conserve, right, to be conservationist when it comes to the natural world, because it's precisely conservatism that's concerned about future generations. It's concerned about the link between generations. This is a very Burkean point. And if conservatism is about preserving a world and passing something on, then that has to be a deep and abiding concern for abandoning what, to my mind, is one of the great mistakes of the liberal order philosophically, which is the idea that our freedom is premised upon conquering nature. And I think this is a view that infects both right liberalism and left liberalism. Right liberalism tends to view the conquest of nature as an economic matter, and left liberalism tends to view the conquest of nature as a biological matter, conquering our own biology, our own nature. But I think these are fundamentally two sides of the same coin, and a conservatism worthy of the name would seek to be much more both sensitive to and defensive of and toward the natural world in all of its forms. So that would be a conservatism that I would like to see.
And so interesting. So that conserving nature, you've also written about intentional communities, and that's sort of the local government, but intentional communities are, I assume, artificial constructs, right? That might be inspired by anything. They might be Wendell Berry-esque conserving nature in the local area, but I guess they could also be hippie communes or racist areas. So can you elaborate on the kind of intentional communities and the limits, if any, on them that you would like to see?
Right. Well, yeah, no, I'm in part, the argument that I make toward the end of the book, and I've made it elsewhere as well, is that it seems to me that one of the conditions of human flourishing is to be a sort of a deep participant in a shared, ongoing local life with other people, this is one of the areas that it seems to me that America is particularly deficient in, and it's deficient precisely because of its deep devotion to a kind of liberalism, which is, as I argue in the book, is really presents itself as a kind of anti-culture, as the absence of the conditions necessary for the flourishing of a variety of cultures. And those conditions would include experiencing ourselves as placeless people, as viewing all in some ways, seeing ourselves as in some ways rooted, or as in many ways shaped by the places where we are. The second of those is to see ourselves as timeless, as generations with very little link to previous generations. And so our freedom is constituted by a break in the temporal continuity of generations. And the last of these is to see ourselves as in some ways outside of nature, as I was just discussing. So the idea of, or my recommendation of a kind of intentional community is, I recognize the paradox and the irony, which is that it's precisely relies upon the existence of liberalism to make this kind of argument, right? It's in some ways to say that if you live in a liberal society, the one way to combat some of its most basic features is to act as a good liberal and to choose to live in a certain way with other people. Now, it's a way of living and choosing to live that runs contrary to, let's say, the default of liberal society. But it's precisely because so many of the cultural and communal inheritances that one might have once expected might have persisted, because those have been fractured, that one has to, in some ways, begin to think about building them anew, and now in a way that intentionally seeks to rub against the grain of the default sort of assumptions and practices of liberal society. So in many ways, I actually think we would be far more likely to see these kinds of communities are going to be, I'll put it this way, will be, on the one hand, they'll probably be viewed as threatening to a liberal society, but precisely because they will be chosen by the people who are members of it, by liberal standards, it can't be condemned, right? Now, it's likely that ultimately liberal society will find something worth condemning, because we're even beginning to see arguments that children have to be treated like liberal, autonomous human beings, and anyone who educates children not to be liberals is therefore oppressing them. These are arguments that are beginning to be made, especially about things like homeschooling. So I think, ultimately, even those kinds of communities are going to come under liberal suspicion. But I think as let's say, a first step, and in the middle, in the sort of median term, these are ways that people can begin to develop the kinds of practices that it seems to me a kind of what I would hope as a kind of post-liberal society people would need to be resilient and to build the kinds of communities that I think might be worthy of admiration and emulation.
Okay, thank you. We have almost 30 questions. Obviously, we're not going to get to all of them, but maybe you could keep your answers brief, and we'll do our best to run through them. Gabe, can you start us off here?
So I'm just going to read some of the questions that have come in, beginning with David Leibowitz, who's a senior at AU, and he asks, since the passing of the 1965 Hart-Keller Act, there's been a massive shift in terms of American demographics. Given that this is, in some sense, a brave new world for our nation. What role do you see for demographic change in American politics and in the future of American conservative political thought? Does it point to a nation in which conservatism is not a viable strain of political thought, or do you see a potential populist conservative backlash coming from figures like Tucker Carlson, Tom Cotton emerging?
Just really in brief, I'll just go back real quick to this graphic. And who knows what the 2020 electorate's going to look like. But what's really interesting to me is that this is where this part of the demographic is where you could potentially build. And it seems to me where naturally there would be likely to be a multiracial kind of working class conservative party. In other words, many, many Hispanics and many, many African Americans would self-identify. If you ask them not what party you belong to, but where on this graph would you place yourself? Many, a very large number would place themselves here. Now, it's in some ways a very much the fault of the Republican Party in the past because of the ways that they have designed the party and decisions that were made to run in particular a kind of Southern strategy that it was aimed to appeal to the old, the white population in the South that was, a very racist population. But that, I think even those conditions are beginning to change. So I think it's possible. It would require something, obviously, I think Trump himself was incapable of doing. It will require a very able and very capable and talented political figure to begin to build what would have to be a multi-generational effort to build a multiracial working class coalition that would be driven by that left upper corner of more socially conservative and more economically liberal population, which I think would be, frankly, in my view, would be the best way for us to overcome the racial divide in this country. I think it is not in the lower left corner. I actually think what I'm seeing today it really concerns me. I think the best area to create a multiracial coalition that brings together social conservatives, more social conservative types, and economic liberals is building that kind of multiracial party. So I actually think that the demographics are in some respects actually kind of good for that purpose and end, but it will require a kind of refashioning. Either of the Democratic or the Republican Party, and frankly, I don't really care which party it is. I would just like to see one of the parties fashion themselves out of those materials.
I'd just like to follow up on that. Professor Tom Merrill has a question. What was the role of race in Trump's election in your view, and what will be the role of race in conservatism moving forward?
Yeah, well, I guess I would just go back to the last question. It's been interesting that on the one hand, Trump as I think his instincts ran in two opposite directions, and one of them was to appeal to all of the worst elements of certain strands of racism that are longstanding in America, and frankly, kind of anti-immigration sentiment that you can find in just about every country, and certainly is we see it happening everywhere. But then he would occasionally speak about reaching out to Hispanics and to African Americans. And, it still is a surprise to many of my colleagues that Trump did better among both of those demographics in the 2016 election than Mitt Romney did among those demographics. So he didn't do exceptionally well in those demographics, but he did better than Romney. And if you'd ask someone, who's going to be more appealing to Hispanics and African Americans, a nice guy, a good centrist right liberal like Romney, or a complete, sort of brute and, rude bore like Donald Trump, people, I assume, would have said, well, obviously Mitt Romney. But I think, again, because Trump intuited that there was this demographic, or there was this underrepresented electoral demographic, that actually many people, especially in the Hispanic and African American communities, would identify with. It seems to me that there's not a demographic barrier necessarily to this. It really had a lot to do, it seems to me, to a lot to do with Trump's particular personality that a different political figure, it seems to me, might have some success in overcoming. But time would certainly tell on that.
Okay. We have a student, Ben Mangiafrida, an alum, who said, it seems as if Professor Deneen would prefer that we all live in a society structured like a Benedictine monastery. Is this accurate? If not, please explain how. If it is, what is the role of women, minorities, especially sexual, and people who consciously choose to reject tradition without harming each other or their societies?
Well, actually, my friend Rod Dreher is the one who wrote the book called The Benedict Option, in which he proposes that that people should withdraw into these kinds of intentional communities and live their lives more or less in contrast to broader currents in American society. So when you say it's more like a Benedictine monastery, I would think that's what that would look like. I think, I guess I'll appeal to a book that I don't know if it gets read in some of your classes or some of your students have read it. But there was a book that came out a few years ago called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. You may have had Murray speak from time to time. He's sort of infamous now because he was shouted down at Middlebury College several years ago. This book, Coming Apart, is really worth reading because he studies, it's really focused on white America and the division that has taken place in white America over the last 50 years. So the book studies white Americans it really statistically studies white Americans from 1960 to the year 2000. And as the title suggests, what he shows is that in white America, what we've seen is a divergence between the both geographic, economic, and life prospects of the lower class and the upper class, the proverbial elite. Those people who have advantages based on their educational attainment, four-year colleges, typically with some kind of postgraduate study, working in certain fields, living in certain areas. I mean, DC being one of the primary targets and areas where many of these people will eventually settle. He talks about the ways that we've seen this incredible geographic sorting that's taken place over this period of time. And at the same time, what he shows, and this is really very fascinating, this is why I think he focuses on white America, is that in 1960, white America, in contrast to certainly African Americans, for obvious reasons, white Americans were largely doing well. They were able to get married, able to form families, have children largely in those families in wedlock, not get divorced. The children would grow up largely without committing crimes, without getting addicted to drugs, without becoming alcoholics. So on a whole range of measures for what constitutes sort of social success versus social catastrophe, social failure, economic failure, and a whole range of measures. In 1960, whatever your economic position in life, whatever your educational position in life, people were doing relatively well. White Americans were doing relatively well. And then over the course of the next 40 years, there was this big dip where both the more wealthy, the more educated, and those who were less educated began to suffer more on all those range of measures. More divorce, more out of wedlock births, more children getting addicted to drugs and alcohol, committing crimes and so forth. But then the upper class pulled themselves out of that and began to rise. And at the same time that you saw this incredible concentration of wealthy, educated elites in increasingly small number of cities in America, that move upward continued to rise. Whereas those people who were in the lower working classes, lower middle class, without the same kind of educational attainment, on all those measures, saw their life prospects decline. What you describe as the Benedictine monastery, I think is what you're describing is the people who are getting married, having children, raising their children to have fairly good moral values, not to commit crimes, not to get addicted to alcohol or drugs, to get a good job, to have good values. And guess what? It's us who are now monopolizing those goods. We are the ones who are living in the Benedictine monastery, if that's what you mean by that question. And the people who voted for Trump are not. The people who live within 10 miles of me in every direction are the ones. I live in South Bend, Indiana, home of Mayor Pete, but right outside of South Bend, Indiana, we're seeing absolute catastrophe, absolute devastation on all of these scores and all these fronts. So I think the argument that I'm making is that what has become a luxury good of the wealthy and the well-educated should now be redistributed. And we should be speaking, those of us in these positions should be speaking about the goods that accrue from stable family life, stable community life, the stability that children can, in which they can flourish. And if that's a monastery, then so be it. But I think it's actually simply, it's just the conditions in which human beings happen to flourish. And right now, the people who are most likely to say, that's backward, that's recidivist, that's a Benedictine monastery, those are the people who are actually enjoying the benefits of precisely those conditions.
Okay. Gabe, next question.
Sure. Another student here at AU, Trey Valentine, wants to know, how does urbanization fit into the conservation of local towns? And should we be concerned at the death of small towns?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, all the studies show that, especially in that demographic I've just described, there's a huge draw, at least until COVID, into the urban areas. COVID may change this. Who knows whether it'll be long-term or even permanent. But that there's been the cities where especially you see, the main engines of economic growth and wealth in the United States today. Finance, tech, government being a big one. All of these cities are drawing, especially the sort of the most talented, the most upwardly mobile of the many places around the country. And it's unlikely that this is going to change unless there is some kind of structural form or even political intervention that takes place. There's obviously good reason for this, and far be it from me to say that people shouldn't leave the sticks from where they happen to be born and go off and live in the bright lights in big city. But what we should notice is that it is creating and fostering this massive political problem in our system. And it's not just a political problem. It's a deep social and even moral problem in our system. And I think of it in the following way. I'm a Catholic, I'm a Christian, and I believe that God created us in such a way that he scattered talent widely. He scattered talent and ability all over the globe, like just with just divine abandon. And so that every small town in the country and every little hamlet and every big city has lots of talented people. But we have designed a system through our politics. It's not ordained by nature. It's not destined. But through our politics and our economic policy, we've designed a system in which what we do, and it's educational too, our educational system, we hoover up all those people. We identify them. We identify them through the SAT and through, the kinds of schools and grades that you go to. And then every school in the country, is vying for the most talented people so they can bring them to their institutions and they can cultivate them for economic and social success, right? And if you think about it, what we are engaged in is the human equivalent of strip mining, right? What you do when you strip mine is you identify a very valuable natural resource, like coal in West Virginia. You remove it, often by taking off a mountaintop. You send it off somewhere to be processed, far away. And once it's processed, it goes into the productive economy. And what gets left behind is complete, ecological blight. Well, that's kind of what we've done with our population now. We've blighted all of these various places in the United States. I actually used to run into Mayor Pete in the dog park near where I live. We both have dogs, and so I will often talk to Mayor Pete. I talked to him a lot about this, and I would praise him for having come back to South Bend rather than go, because he used to work for McKinsey in New York, and rather than just staying there and doing the usual thing, he came back to South Bend. He became our mayor. He made South Bend a lot better. He made South Bend a much better city. And of course, what he wants to do now is jump ship, and he'll join the Biden administration at the first drop of a hat. But one of the things I do try to tell my students is, look, you'll be drawn to New York and be drawn to Washington because you're ambitious and you want to do great things. But if you really want to do great things, you're not going to do it in Washington in all likelihood, and you're not going to do it in New York in all likelihood. You might get wealthy, but if you really want to do great things, think about South Bend, or think about Iowa City. Think about all the places in the country where all the talented people have been drawn away, and imagine the difference you could make in that place, like Mayor Pete made in the little city of South Bend. I mean, he has actually made this into a much better city, this one guy. So I do try to appeal to my students and say, urbanization is a reality, and I'd like to see actual policies begin to try to shift some of the economic productivity of our country away from these, sort of magnets of a few cities in the country. I just think it's bad for our politics that this is the case. But to my ambitious students at the good schools I've taught at, I try to appeal to their ambition. Say, you really want to be great, you want to be remembered, you're far more likely to have a statue raised to you in perpetuity in the small town or a small city somewhere else in America than you ever are to have a statue in Washington, D.C., which will probably just get torn down. No. But that is far more likely that you will make a giant impact in some of those places.
So, Patrick,
yes, but I agree, it's a problem, but I really think it's something that we need to think about, not just as an inevitability, but as something that really requires us to think about generously and politically.
I'm really struck by the number of questions that have to do with race, concern about white supremacy, discrimination on the basis of sex, and minorities in general. There's a lot of questions about that. And I know you've talked about it a little bit, but that's obviously, you just look at the news and what's going on in the country, a major battlefront, a major division, Trump, calling on the Proud Boys to, stand back and stand by doesn't help, and any of that, and Charlottesville. And so can I just ask you to maybe address this again, on just the question of race and the possibility of a future conservatism, and is the conservative base, in your view, so fundamentally racist that that this is going to be a persistent problem, or is this something that can be gotten beyond?
Yeah. Well, I don't know, because honestly, I do think that the country is becoming, on both the right and the left, is becoming so identified increasingly by racial terms and definitions. That it may be that this is an insurmountable problem in our politics, as it seems to have been through much of our history. But I'm in many ways, I guess I would want to throw the question in some ways back on the questioners, which it doesn't seem to me at this point in time that we really have a good answer to this question in the elite institutions where I've lived my adult life, in Princeton and Georgetown, and now at Notre Dame. What these institutions have really, certainly over the last 20 years, and even more intensely in the last 5 years, and of course, even more intensely in the last few months, what they've really been dedicated to is the idea that somehow through access to elite institutions, what we now increasingly call diversity and inclusion, this will be the major way that we repair and we increase equality in the United States, is through the constant mantra of diversity and inclusion. And yet what we also know is that the institutions that are the most likely to speak the most loudly and the most insistently on these questions are also the institutions that are most complicit in sifting the winners from the losers in our society, right? I mean, I can't help but be struck by the deep irony of the president of Harvard University banning social clubs, some of which accepted only men and some of which accepted only women. The president of Harvard University got up and gave a speech and said, we are not going to have any institutions at Harvard University in which there is inequality. Now think about that for a second. The president of Harvard University said, we're not going to have any inequality. How many people get accepted to Harvard University? What's the likelihood of the average American going to Harvard University? So I can't help but wonder whether the institutions that are most complicit in constructing a massive, right, divide in our country today and in the world today are the places that are going to be best equipped to create the conditions for genuine equality in our country today. We're going to have a lot of people, and increasingly I think it's going to be, it's not going to be defined by race. It seems that we are destined to have more and more people who are going to be underemployed because of automation, who are likely to be not just underemployed, but under-sustained because of a lack of real community, a lack of real resources, not just money, but the kind of resources you need as a human being in terms of family, extended family, neighbors, a community, churches, associations, the thick and rich nature of a society that sustains people through good and especially in bad times, the people that you turn to when you're in trouble. And what are we doing, what are institutions, these elite institutions doing to shore up and to, especially in those places that are the most devastated in our country today? I think this is, I think by doing this, we confront racism, genuinely. I think this is how we confront racism. It's not by increasing by 3% the number of students who are going to get admitted to Harvard. That's a Band-Aid, and frankly, it's just a Band-Aid that covers a wound of bad conscience. That's what it is. I think until we're actually genuinely willing to confront where people live and where people are going to continue to live their lives, that we're going to confront this. So I'm all for thinking about where we move as a society to move beyond racism. But I think we need to stop, in many ways, especially at our elite institutions, stop thinking that, you know, the way in which we're congratulating ourselves for egalitarianism is going to be the path or the route to doing this. I think it's going to have to be by strengthening the fabric of our civil society. And that means we're going to have to be willing, as these people in these institutions that right now seem to not to want to talk about family formation and raising children and the kinds of strong communities and civil associations we need. And yes, churches that we need. But until we do that, I don't think we're really going to address the problem of racism and inequality in this country.
That's a powerful response to the elites. What about the racism that seems to be percolating from below?
Well, I think unless the elites in many ways begin to talk about it in this way, I actually think we're going to see a worsening of that racism present itself.
Okay, two more questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Two more questions. This is from Austin Drake in AU undergrad. In Why Liberalism Failed, you identified the founders' Lockean theory of republicanism as one of the roots of the present failures of liberalism. If you had the opportunity to rewrite the Constitution, would you? And if so, what changes would you make?
Well, that's a good question. Boy, it's a tough one because, of course, there's a lot of water under the bridge now. But I guess I would. I'm a keen reader and admirer of many of the opponents to the Constitution, the so-called anti-federalists, and they were deeply concerned about especially what they saw as the consolidation of power in the central government as a threat especially to I guess, formation of democratic practices and the virtues of democratic practices. So I guess in the first instance, I would want to revisit how we could empower in real ways more local forms of political participation. And I think this would have two beneficial effects. It would give us incentives to actually think about ourselves as citizens in an active dimension on a much more local scale, so that we would be exercising the kinds of civic muscles of discussion and debate with people that we actually live with, that surround us. As Tocqueville describes it, could, through that kind of interaction, actually end up somewhere else than where we began. So to enlarge our hearts, as he puts it. And I think it would have a second beneficial effect that I think would be, many of us might agree to right now, which is that it would take a lot of the pressure off of national elections. It would allow for a lot more local variety and make every national election not the end all be all of whether one side won or lost. And I think a lot of, I do think that a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of the frenzy and even near insanity that's taking place at the level of national politics, this has been taking place for many years, is because almost every policy and every decision now runs through the federal government. And we are just simply too big, too diverse, too multifarious a nation for that to continue in any really sustainable way. So, I mean, I think the Constitution, in many ways, you could say, was originally written with a lot more recognition of relative state autonomy. And it's over the course of time that has changed through both structural, economic, and of course, Supreme Court decisions. So it's maybe not so much a matter of changing the Constitution as it would be to moving us, I don't think you go from 2020 to 1789, but maybe you move from 2020 to 1990 or something. In other words, you begin to move, the dial a little bit so that you're not just continuing in the same direction. So asking for kind of a major structural change to the Constitution, it runs against my conservative grain, which is to say, well, you're asking me to create a revolution. I think it would be more a matter of maybe, certain things would need to just, again, be moved in more of a direction to where the Constitution was, and maybe a little bit more to what the Constitution that its opponents might have wanted, a more local and a more small d democratic population.
Okay.
Constitution.
Last question. I'm going to ask you to play prognosticator. 4 weeks from now, after the voting, what do you think will happen to the country? What future do you see with a Trump victory? And what future do you see with a Biden victory?
I'm sad to say it, but things are not going to get better. I think we're in for a lot more division. And in fact, maybe worse division than we've experienced in the last 4 years. Well, I hate to depart on this dour note, but I think we all know what's likely to happen if Trump wins re-election. And it's in all likelihood, if he wins re-election, it's through an electoral college victory with a minority of the overall vote, the sense by a large number of the population will be that we have completely illegitimate system. And the effort, I think, obviously, what we'll see happening on the streets, increase the protest likelihood, mostly peaceful protests would under that condition, condition would likely be widespread. I think we can expect a deep, deep, deep scarring divide in the country in the event of a Trump victory. But I think in the event of a Biden victory, while there are many who think, well, he'll return us to normalcy, we will see, in all likelihood, we will see very strong efforts, especially by likely people in Biden's administration who will be further to the left of Biden, to push what has already been talked about, to push an agenda that will prevent the possible election, a future election of anyone like Trump ever again. So to move, structurally move the power of the country to the urban areas through, what has already been talked about. So introducing several new states, Washington, D.C., possibly one of them, Puerto Rico, another one, by removing the filibuster as a kind of, you could say it's the last, it's among the last of the mechanisms by which you're required to get, in some ways, at least a kind of super majority or close to a super majority to make any really big decisions in the country, that there has to be a relatively high degree of consensus. So to go to a strict majority in the Senate and then increase the size or pack the Supreme Court to effectively reflect the last election. If this were to happen, which seems to me to be at least plausible, you would basically be shutting 45% of the population out of political power for the foreseeable future. And when that happens, when it's happened in the past in other countries, that leads to political violence. It can lead to civil war. It can lead to calls for secession. In other words, it seems to me that what will be seen as a necessary remediation for what will many view as a political aberration could lead to what I fear would be, in some ways, a kind of political overreach that would, again, further, not just divide, but seriously push the country into the real possibility of violence and some form of a much warmer, we've been calling it a cold civil war, but a warmer to hot civil war. So I look, I hope I'm wrong about all of this. Yeah, I do, but I don't see this election settling and resolving any of the issues that have obviously been very much on the front burner in the last certainly 3.5 years, and I think much longer, in fact. So on that cheerful note.
Yeah, okay, so everybody go out there and vote and do your duty. Patrick, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I actually do think, and I'm hoping, I actually do think that if Biden wins the presidency and the Republicans hold the Senate, I actually think that's probably the best electoral outcome. I realize many of your listeners may not want that outcome, but I think for the sake of the country, that would be the best electoral outcome. And it would be in some ways a kind of stalemate, but I actually think there are some productive things that could come out of that kind of arrangement. I actually think we would see some movement on race relations, and I think we would see a pretty significant spending on an infrastructure bill. So I for all of the pitfalls that are always involved in divided government, that's what I'm hoping for in the election.
Okay, good. So an optimistic note.
There you go. I'll leave it on a slightly hopeful note. Right?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us.